Judy Schultz, congratulations on Freddy's War. It's just a wonderful read.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to ask you what sparked this novel.
Part of what sparked it is probably, and I'm not certain of this, but I think it's probably where I grew up and the time in which I was growing up, because remember, I'm not young, and what was going on in the world at that time and how it affected us later on. That was part of it. The other is hinging on memoir, because I knew a lot of these characters, either someone very much like them or a composite of them. Now, it's not an autobiography, but these characters ran through my life. So that's kind of how it happened.
Oh, great. And you have a long-standing interest in China, I believe. Can you tell me how that began?
When I was, again, we're going back to early childhood. When I was a little kid, we moved constantly. My dad was a greener pastures man. We were always moving, and we moved from one tiny prairie village to another. We were always the strangers. But we weren't alone, because there was one more family of strangers in each of those little towns. They were always the Chinese people who ran the restaurant. So that was part of the connection. The other connection was food, because, you know, I'm obsessed with food, and the Chinese restaurants were like Aladdin's caves to me. And from the very first egg roll I ever ate, which I was probably 3 at the time, I've loved Chinese food.
And so did that lead to trips to China, and how?
Well, the trips to China came later, but among these people in the Chinese restaurants, there was one restaurant in particular and one family in particular that I remember who always came at Christmas with armloads of gifts, which is very important in Chinese culture. And one of the gifts they gave my mother was a silk picture, and it was a place in China with the huge karst formations which you see in southern China. And that became my dream destination. From the time I was little, it hung over the piano, and I'd be sitting there practicing away, looking at that thing, thinking, I want to go there. And eventually, as a journalist, I was able to go there. But that was a long time, you know, from when you're a little kid to a mature woman. And once I put my feet in that country for the first time, I felt that connection so strongly. I love going back there. I go whenever I can.
And your interest in the Battle of Hong Kong and that part of the war, how did that develop?
My father's very good friend, who I remember very well, was a veteran of the Battle of Hong Kong. He was very troubled. He brought back all the baggage, as so many of those men, those who survived, did. He had spent nearly 4 years in a Japanese prison camp. He also had a Chinese wife who I became quite close to. And that's kind of how that whole thing evolved. He was another of the people, and because we were living in northern Manitoba at that time, that part of the world seems to collect characters. And some of the characters that wander through Freddy's War were the characters who were wandering through our lives at that time. People like Deaf Gilbert and Dumas the Trapper, and these were very realistic people.
They're very realistic in the book, for sure. The battles that, that you draw in such a searing way in the book are historically accurate. And I don't think I'll ever forget St. Stephen's, the slaughter at St. Stephen's, which I hadn't heard of before. Can you talk about incorporating historical events into fiction a little?
It's interesting that you say the Battle of St. Stephen's, which you hadn't heard of before. Very few Canadians know enough about what happened on Christmas that year. But regarding incorporating history, I think it's important when you're referencing history in a novel or any time to be as accurate as you can for the sake of the people. Now, if your history is dealing with the 1300s, it doesn't matter so much. But our more recent history, and for me, you know, something that happened in 1945 is recent, relatively so. And so I think that it's more important as we move forward in history to try to maintain that accuracy. These people, some of them are still alive. So you do them honor by trying to stick to that truth. The other thing is authenticity. So, for example, this was in Hong Kong. I had been to Hong Kong numbers of times, but I needed to go back for this book and walk that area. I had to go into Wong Nai Chung Gap. I had to go to St. Stephen's, which you mentioned, and with the history master, go through that place and think, okay, this is where this happened and that happened, and this is how it would have happened. The weirdest one was the bunker. The bunker where Tony Cecchi in the book is hurt. I went in there and understood why somebody who had claustrophobia would not be able to tolerate that place. And that's why he wasn't in the bunker when the grenade exploded. He was in the tunnel, which saved his life, but not his legs. That bunker gave me the creeps. I went through it with a Chinese military historian, very young man, but military historian. And I asked him what that sign meant up on the entrance, and he said, oh, in Chinese this says beware of snakes, which is just one more thing about authenticity. Once I was in there again, I could feel some of the fear that those men would have felt, because it would have been hot and there would be rats, there could be snakes, it's claustrophobic, all of that. So the authenticity historically is important, and to do that, I think a writer needs to go and walk in those steps if they can.
From the way you're talking about honoring characters, and especially veterans, it seems to me that it's important for you that we're conscious of the effects of World War II, of that war on our own generation. Is that, can you talk about that a little bit? Is that true?
Well, I think the effects of any war are important as we go through the generations. There is one thing that doesn't change, and that is that when men come back from war, or women, there is always collateral damage. There always has been, and there still is. And it's regarding the fact that when people go to war, they go over as person A. They come back, they might be person B. They're not the same. They cannot remain the same. We haven't learned a great deal about that because we haven't changed our way of dealing with these issues. So we still have wars, and probably always will, because we haven't learned not to. I'm sorry, I'm wandering. I didn't answer your question, did I?
That's okay. No, well, that started. You were getting there, and it was really interesting. So I'm going to ask it again.
All right.
And then if it goes
Sideways
somewhere else,
again?
then we'll
Okay.
just take another question.
All
When you talk about honoring your characters, when honoring the veterans especially, it seems to me it's important to you that we're conscious of the effects of World War II in our lives, in our generation's lives. Is that true? And would you like to speak to that a little?
I think it's important that we honor the history of war. If you're going to go way, way back, because there have always been wars, the detail of the history is not so important because those people are no longer around. But there are people still with us who were in World War II. And there are lots and lots of families who suffered loss that are very much here. So I think we have to honor those memories by sticking as closely as we can to the actual history of an event. The other reason that I try to be historically accurate as much as possible is authenticity. And this is a sense of place. You know, how do you convey to the reader what it's like in a bunker, or what it must have been like? And that's why I went back to Hong Kong and visited St. Stephen's with the history master. And I went back to Wong Nai Chung Gap and to those bunkers with a Chinese military historian. Walked in so that I could say this is how it must have felt. When Tony Cecchi went in there, he said, "Oh my God, I can't be in this place. It was too close, it was too hot." And so he was actually in the entrance when the grenade went off, which saved his life, but not his legs.
Yeah.
So it's about authenticity as well, honoring and authenticity.
Thanks so much. That makes sense. I'd like to ask you about some writing techniques now that you use in the book. I was especially struck by the different perspectives from other characters. So we don't get Freddy's story just from Freddy's point of view or from a distant third-person narrator. We really get inside the heads of especially Sue Lee, I'm thinking of, and Joanna and Hope. Was that your intention when you started writing the book, or was that something that evolved as you went along?
It evolved, but it evolved because if you are a witness at the scene of an accident, and there are 4 other witnesses, there will be 5 accounts of that accident. Well, this is a story of a man's life from the perspective of people from very different places. We had Yip Lee, who was a Chinese Canadian. We had Sue Lee, who was a young girl raised in China. We had Joanna, who was a young woman who'd lost her husband. She wasn't sure that what had happened, but she fell in love. So we have all these different perspectives. And then we have Hope, the little girl. Now, I wanted Hope to confide in the reader. So she speaks in the first person. And she's the only person who does.
Yes, exactly. And there's this lovely moment where she sees eyes in the forest. Can you talk about that a little bit and what that means?
Yes. Children are very wise. And Hope was a little girl who spent a lot of time under the table listening. Eavesdropping is what she was doing. But she believed in things that as an adult she wouldn't have believed in. Now, she missed her dad. She had to believe that he was still there somewhere. And she saw eyes in the forest at night. Now, if you look into a northern forest at night, you may very well see eyes, and they could be wolves, they could be, you know, whatever. She thought it was her dad. And she, in the end of that chapter, she speaks to the reader by saying, "Good night, Dad." It tells the reader that Hope still believes, even though her mother has said, "No, no, no, no. No, you're just dreaming. That's not your dad. Your dad is gone." Hope still believes. And that's what she's telling us.
And it seems that he might be there lingering.
We can't say he isn't.
I have to ask you about the beginning of the book, which I went back to after I finished reading. Readers do this when they finish a book. They don't want it to be over. We start all over again. So I read the first chapter, and there's Hope, adult Hope, seeing Freddy and choosing not to say hello to him. And it's a heartbreaking moment where they recognize each other and there's no contact. Why doesn't she say hello?
I think she's afraid of what he might have become. Because she can see what he has become. Is not the same Freddy that she knew and loved. And I'll tell you an interesting thing about that little scene. I used to take the bus once in a while just for the fun of taking the bus, because I like to watch people. I like to watch them interact. And there was a bus route that I was on every once in a while, and out the window I saw this very striking older man. I saw him at the beginning of a season. I saw him several times throughout the winter, and at the end of that winter he had obviously fallen apart. And he was wearing exactly what Freddy wears in the book. And one day I was looking out the window of the bus right in front of where CBC is now. I was looking at him, and all of a sudden he looked up and our eyes met. And it was a strange moment. I didn't know him. I've never seen him since. But there was something about it that twigged, and I was already working on Freddy's War. So that for me was, well, that's where that scene came from. And I still kind of wonder who that man was. And if, as I believed, as I saw this year go on and saw him change, if maybe he was one of these people that the world had changed for him somehow.
I'd like to ask you about this award. It's the Alberta Readers Choice Award. So the winner is chosen by the public. And how you feel about that as a writer, is it different than being shortlisted for an award chosen by your literary peers?
I think there can be no better way to choose than by a public vote. And I like the way it's controlled, so you can only vote once from one computer.
Right.
So you can't sit there and hit it 10 times.
Right.
Because if readers can relate to your characters, a writer can't ask for more than that. And I love it when I talk to people about this book and they say, oh, like for example, last night I was talking to a group of women and one of them said to me, I wanted Joanna to fall in love with Stan. Why didn't she? That's a real compliment, because people get involved in the book and they make their own endings. So yes, the readers are the people that really matter. It's great to be judged by a jury of your peers, but the readers are the ones that we as writers really have to care about. And we want to know that we touched readers somehow.
Thank you so much, Judy.
Welcome.